Okay, so good morning. Welcome back, everybody. Hope you had a good holiday season. This is ENS 204G, American Cultural History. Today's class, I'm going to take you through syllabus briefly and then dive right into it, get into the first lecture. We're going to be talking about Pre-Columbian America and imperialism as well. So just take you through the content of the syllabus here. Of course, please revisit it on the Canvas page since it's posted there. Name of the course, my name, time, of course, Wednesdays here, unless they change it on us. In this course, we explore the diverse, turbulent, and evolving cultural history of America, evolving since it's still in process, obviously. In the contemporary context, the United States may be best known as a declining superpower, declining for the last 20 years, I guess we could say. But the pervasive influence of American culture, politics, media, and aesthetics remains as strong as ever throughout the world. For example, America's version of democracy, which is not democracy writ large, but just a version of it, continues to frame many international dialogues on politics. And also, in terms of American influence, the Hollywood industry, culture industry, film, and television serves as a massive exporter of the nation's culture, probably one of the biggest exporters of culture in human history. At the same time, America's volatile position at the forefront of the world stage is quite a recent phenomenon from the 20th century, we could say, not least because the country itself is relatively young, and that applies to the United States that exists today, as well as the Americas themselves when it comes to human habitation, something I'll be talking about more. Our goal in this class will be to chart a trajectory that outlines the emergence, consolidation, ascension, and decline of the nation across multiple centuries. We will pay attention to the ways that both the land and people of America have undergone rapid and in some cases traumatic transformations during its history. We will also afford attention to the complex intersectional dynamics of American culture, noting how categories of race, ethnicity, class, gender, and sexuality have changed over time while also remaining intertwined. It's basically what intersectionality means. It means when you take those individual categories, don't look at them in isolation necessarily, but look at how they are interwoven and play off of one another. The intention of the class will not be to provide a complete history of America, which given our time constraints would be an impossible task. So don't come to this class for your comprehensive, outview of an overline of America, because that's impossible. Rather, we will focus on specific flashpoints in different eras while working to assemble a narrative that traverses American cultural history. So it's going to be selective. Contact information there, email address, office here in Verrill. For small questions, check the syllabus first, because a lot of the time the answer to your question will be contained on the syllabus. Otherwise, send an email for a long inquiry. You can set up a meeting with me. My name is Gregory or Greg. Grades for the class broken down according to the tests. I'm not going to go through this in extensive detail. I would assume most of you actually took the British and European cultural history course. The tests will be the same as they were in that class, at least in terms of their setup, with the 3 multiple choice tests spread across the semester. The last test a little bit longer and worth a little bit more information on the dates of the tests there. So make sure you keep those in mind, record those on your calendar. Take note that it's not the same day as the class. That's on the Monday, so make sure you have that marked off in your calendar. Take the test on Canvas. We don't have equivalent seated tests set by the administration, for instance. Those are online. Take those on Canvas. So information there, they're not comprehensive tests. So the first test is session 1 to session 4, second test, session 5 to session 8, third test, session 9 to session 12. So it's broken down into those brackets. As I said, the questions will be derived from the lectures. Anything discussed during the lectures could potentially appear on one of the tests. These are not going to be simple fact-based questions, so you can't just Google the answers. Rather, they're going to make reference to the course content. Make sure you interpret the questions correctly, and make sure you bracket off time, which you can take the test, because for each of these, they're open basically the entire day, because you won't be permitted to take a test after it is closed. So lecture-based class is due to the size of enrollment, also the distance component. But if you do have a question, then please ask one. Interrupt me because I just get caught up in what I'm talking about. So if you do have a question, then please do ask one. And there is also the possibility that there will be additional material, though I'll try to stay on schedule. The lecture is accompanied by PowerPoint presentations, which are available on the Canvas page, so you can review those afterwards. Make sure you download the PowerPoint and then play it as a slideshow, so you'll be able to see all the text and the images if they move. As I say there, if a topic extends across multiple classes, I may update the posted PowerPoint slides with new slides and information. However, I will not remove any of the slides or delete information unless it's just to make a correction. Say there, you are encouraged to attend the lectures in person. If you do attend, don't interrupt them by arriving late or talking during them. But the lectures are available in the Panopto block, perhaps also YouTube versions as well. I don't know if I'll do that yet, but if so, they'll be posted below the session headings. But I mean, it's going to be the same lecture. Important point at the end, don't put off watching the lectures and taking notes on them until the day before the tests as well. First of all, you're cramming too much information all at once, and also you don't want to encounter a computer error that will prevent you from accessing them. Rather, study the lectures in advance. And there you have the weekly schedule, which is a chronological schedule, essentially. Obviously, it's a lot of history and information to pack into one class. So as I say, move through different eras and take snapshots, flashpoints, and a variety of eras, basically starting from the time of human habitation in the Americas, proceeding up into the present day. You see the tests. First test coming up Monday, February 6th, so it's actually not that far from now, covering the first 4 classes. We don't have class, by the way, on the Wednesday, February 15th, so that's the one just before the reading week, and then, of course, reading week is off. Second test, March 13th. Final test on Monday, April 17th, after the end of the semester. Any questions about the syllabus? Okay then, so let's get into it with the class. So I don't know if I have a full class today, but I guess it depends on how quickly we get through this material here. We start here with the first lecture, which is going to cover Pre-Columbian America and European imperialism. You see the itinerary, the 2 subjects that are included in the title. We start with that idea of Pre-Columbian America, which has come to refer to America prior to the arrival of one person, Christopher Columbus. That's where the name comes from, but it basically means prior to the invasion of European settlers at the end of the 15th century. And there are a couple of topics we're going to go through, assumptions and narratives about America. And here I should make the distinction. Generally, when I say America, we'll be focused on the land that corresponds to modern day United States of America, but to an extent we also talk about the Americas, which basically refers to the continents themselves, North America, Central America, and South America. So we'll be talking about the place that corresponds to the modern United States, but also the Americas at large. In this section, the arrival of people on the continent and the Paleo-Americans, first settlers to arrive in America, and settlements in North America as well. You see a painting depicting Tenochtitlan. That's the capital of the Aztec Empire, which is a Native American empire in what is now Mexico. We should start immediately with the question of how we construct a narrative about America prior to the arrival of Christopher Columbus and the Europeans. And I say there that for many years, pre-Columbian America was represented in history as a unitary and static place. That was the general tendency for a long time, which has been changing recently. What I mean by that is just seeing the native culture that existed there as basically one unified whole, as though there was a single group of people or a single nation of people who all had the same beliefs, who all spoke the same language, who basically represented this one mass, this one conglomerate. That was never historically accurate, but it was just a way of lumping all the people together into one whole, and I think it was largely an excuse not to talk about them, basically to just take this single mass of people and then to dismiss them. And also I say static as well, meaning unchanging. Something static is resistant to evolution and transformation over time. That too was a common perception, a historical representation of pre-Columbian America. It was the kind of place where the people and the culture and the nations stayed the same for hundreds, if not thousands of years, never changing. Almost this kind of unmoving mass of people. Now, neither of those things were ever true, and there is a lot of pushback against that, but I'm not sure the recent narratives are that much more nuanced or instructive, at least when we start talking about mainstream narratives, because they've kind of collapsed into a series of simple binaries in contemporary terms. I say recent narratives, especially as they're framed in American politics, as U.S. politics, which we're going to be talking about later in the course, which often frames things according to simple dichotomies, which means just this kind of us versus them, or it's either this option or it's that option, and these are often dichotomies that mirror the landscape of contemporary American politics, which is divided down the middle in half. Left wing, right wing, Democrat, Republican. Depending on who you're talking to, you'll get one version or the other version of Native Americans, which I think is unfortunate. The two versions, on the one hand, the idea that the Native American people who lived in this era were relatively primitive people, backwards people, lacking any of the advanced cultures or civilizations that existed in places in Europe or Asia. Basically, people who lacked a lot of the infrastructure or technology that had already been developed in other places around the world, and that was essentially the reason why they were slated for conquest. That's one version of the narrative. People who were basically less advanced than the European invaders, if not people in other parts of the world as well. The alternative narrative kind of actually draws upon portions of that, but claims that the Native American cultures were in many respects better than the European cultures, but better for a series of sort of intangible reasons. More egalitarian, for instance, meaning more equal, or fulfilling the ideas of equal rights among people in a better way, and also with a more harmonious relationship with the natural world, which might actually be true to an extent, and that usually feeds into the idea that their cultures, the groups of people, were living a more moralistic life, or a more ethical life than that of the invaders. And as I say, this just follows kind of basic binary logic. You have one version of events, or you have a kind of opposite version of events. Well, what we should do is take a look at both versions of events and sort of weed out the kind of ideological posturing and find the truth, the facts that reside in each of them. Now you see another representation of the capital, the old Aztec Empire, a kind of Venice of the Americas, remarkable place, a kind of island city at the time, which grew up to prominence by the time of Columbus's arrival. As I say there, in truth, The pre-Columbian Americas were home to an enormously diverse array of groups. That's the first point to make, that this was not just one group of people, not just the natives or the aboriginals, but a whole vast array of different groups of people, different cultures, different nations, and indeed different empires as well, most famously the Aztec Empire and the Inca Empire as well. We would say the area that corresponds to North America, and here I mean North America, north of Mexico, that area probably didn't have anything in the realm of an empire as such, but nonetheless certainly different groups and different settlements as well. And just to give you a sense of that, the area of North America, so it corresponds to the US and Canada today, that alone featured over 300 different languages at the time of Columbus's arrival. So 300 different languages were being spoken in that area, corresponding to different groups of people. So let's go back to the beginning then. Where did the first inhabitants come from? The first people in North America and the Americas at large. And this immediately takes us into that very interesting topic, or interesting to me, that human habitation in the Americas is, relatively speaking, quite a recent phenomenon, more so than in other places around the world. Say there, up until about 15,000 years ago, the Americas appear to be uninhabited by humans. Now, you go back into the past, you talk about the gradual incremental evolution of human life, the emergence of human life in Africa, and then the kind of movement migration out from there into Europe, into different parts of Asia. Now, that was a process that happened many tens of thousands of years ago. And if you took the British and European cultural history course, you'll also remember the development of what we might consider a modern version of humanity, meaning modern in the sense of human ways of thinking, or human patterns of behavior. Those patterns of behavior that really distinguished us, separated us from the animal kingdom. The time of the cognitive revolution, well, that emerged in the range of 50,000 years ago, 70,000 years ago, around then. Humans had even reached the continent of Australia roughly 50,000 years ago. You might think of Australia as being a kind of isolated landmass, but humans were there long before they ever got to the Americas. So for many years, tens of thousands of years after the development of what we consider modern humanity, the Americas seem to have remained untouched by human presence in a kind of state where just ecology, wildlife, animal life, those things ruled the entire continent. How come? Well, it seems as though our ancestors didn't have a good way to get to the Americas, because here you have these continents, and you have the Pacific Ocean on one side and the Atlantic Ocean on the other side. They just didn't have a way to get across the ocean. Simple as that. So they were able to spread themselves out from Africa into the Eurasian landmass all across there. You can't cross an ocean at that time. I mean, they did have sailing vessels which allowed them to get as far as Australia, but that was a kind of hop, jump, and skip process. Can't really do the same thing with the Americas, just too much distance to cover. However, humans, like so many other creatures, do find a way to migrate over distances, and it seems they were able to do that in the range of 15,000 years ago, when we start to see human habitation in the Americas. And the most commonly accepted scenario, not proven of course, because we don't know for certain, but this is a speculative idea, is that they crossed the Bering Strait. The Bering Strait is this narrowest strip of water which separates the very eastern point of what is now Russia from the very western point of what is now the US. That would be Alaska, so up there in the north. During a period of glacial ice, would have been frozen over so people could actually walk across the strait. And it seems as though people who inhabited the region of Siberia began walking across the ice here and spilling over into Alaska. So they entered the kind of deep north of the Americas originally, and then flowing downward. It's unclear how quickly they dispersed themselves south, but this was basically the passageway, and eventually to the use of ships as well to get across the strait. What kinds of people at this time? Well, hunter-gatherer people. So people who are not establishing permanent settlements, and people who no doubt did not grasp that they were entering a new continent. They would not have seen it in that way. They were likely following wildlife that were taking a similar journey because they would have been hunting a variety of different wildlife. Probably the most famous example, the great woolly mammoth. All seen images of the woolly mammoth creature that went extinct kind of around this time or a little bit after this time, probably tracking animals, following animals. And so, okay, they're heading in this direction. We'll go that direction too. And unbeknownst to them, they're actually entering an entirely different world. The original inhabitants, the people who came there, known today as Paleo-Americans, which is just a kind of broad term for grouping these hunter-gatherers, must have found themselves in a place of extraordinary biodiversity and wildlife. They must have felt as though they had hit the jackpot after kind of working their way through Siberia, which might have provided some slim pickings. Suddenly, they landed in a place that would have been like the place of the dinosaurs in the sense of just untapped wildlife and plant life, a kind of garden of Eden of abundance here, which would have included all sorts of remarkable large animals, large mammals, still remarkable animals for a long time, but these various creatures, they're all extinct now, but mentioned the woolly mammoth there, plus a giant beavers. I think that's from a sci-fi image. I don't think that's how it would have looked, but beavers that would have been the size of bears, massive sloths, for example, giant bison, other really incredible, remarkable creatures, and the Paleo-Americans would have made use of them. They would have hunted them, and it was their arrival that was no doubt responsible for the extinction of most of these creatures, because here's another idea from the British and European cultural history class, if you took it, it became one of the true facts of history that anytime you see a big influx of humans into an ecosystem, when you see that, you suddenly see a drop in biodiversity. Suddenly you see humans causing extinction events, not necessarily deliberately, but just overhunting the population. And why? Well, because the humans could hunt the animal life at such a level of coordination, cooperation, that they had enormous advantages over creatures that were, so much bigger than them and had evolved in isolation from them. So the Paleo-Americans would have been hunting these giant mammals. They would have hunted them out. We don't know how quickly that took, but it would have occurred. But this would have forced transitions and changes in their behavior, as a lot of these big lumbering animals that they had been hunting for food and also supplies as well, as they died out, then they would have had to adjust their techniques and their strategies for living off of the land, and they would have developed likely more sophisticated hunting techniques, and this also would have spurred a diversification in their diets. I mean, out of necessity, they would have had to look for alternative food sources. Out of necessity, they would have had to develop higher levels of coordination and cooperation. Diversification of diets would have meant healthier people, which would have meant more people living longer, and there would have been increases in the total population numbers of these individuals. And there also would have been the growth of settlements, which I'll talk about in a moment. See, increasing population numbers. You go back 10,000 years ago, so estimates are correct. That would be a full 5,000 years after humans had started to enter the continent or continents, and you probably would have had something like 100,000 people living in what is now North America. Now, you pause for a moment. That's not a lot of people. I mean, you think of 100,000 people, I mean, that's a town, essentially. So imagine those people dispersed, spread across the massive range of land that is North America. So they're kind of just this small smattering of people on the continent at that juncture. But there would have been increases over time. So the point you get to the year 1000 BC, or BCE, as it's sometimes called, so that's 3,000 years ago, well, then you have 1 million people. Still, not a lot by modern standards, not a lot compared to, say, the United States today, but certainly the population numbers have built up much more. With increased population numbers came permanent settlements. And this was a product of agricultural practices which developed across different parts of the world, in the range of 10,000 years ago. And this basically meant people settling down for extended periods. The hunter-gatherer lifestyle is a lifestyle of kind of constant motion and movement. You don't necessarily stay in one place because people are essentially following the wildlife around. So you wouldn't really have permanent settlements in the hunter-gatherer communities, but permanent settlements would be more fixed locations, and that's where you see the emergence of towns and even to a degree cities. Didn't have a lot of big permanent settlements in what is now North America. Those would actually spring up further to the south, and that's just kind of part of the trend, the sway of history. But here you have one example, that's Snaketown, or a depiction of Snaketown, central settlement of the Hohokam, a group of that was located in what is now the southwestern United States. The Hohokam, they didn't call themselves that. That's a name that's been applied retroactively to them. And these are people who built stone towns and irrigation channels necessary in the arid climate. Southwestern U.S. is a place of quite arid country, so they built quite advanced irrigation channels. However, they did not make use of the wheel. They did not keep records, so they didn't write stuff down. And the only animals they domesticated were dogs. And so it's interesting the way that these different things work. Advanced developed irrigation systems. Well, that's a necessity. It makes practical sense. Funny to think, these other things don't really make practical sense. Why not the invention of the wheel? Well, largely because they didn't have the domesticated animals that were used in conjunction with the wheel. For instance, oxen or even horses. There you have animals, take the animal, combine it with a wheel, and there you go. You have a very efficient process of moving materials or doing work. Well, they didn't have those domesticated animals. Interesting story. There were horses actually in the Americas, but they went extinct in the Americas prior to the settlements existing there. Keep records, not unusual in this kind of prehistory period for people to build up small towns and settlements, but they didn't actually write stuff down. The domestication of dogs, hunter-gatherer people have been domesticating dogs for the aid in hunting. They didn't domesticate any of the other animals. Other groups, because as I say, there were other groups of people, other nations, other languages, other Native American groups built settlements near the banks of the Mississippi on fertile land that would have sustained much wildlife. And here is a story that is as old as humanity itself. The tendency to build settlements and communities on the banks of rivers, especially prominent rivers, because you get fertile land, the rivers attract wildlife, and later on, or even to an extent at this point, rivers are also a great way to travel as well, especially when we talk about a pre-industrial era, which all of this is. Well, you can walk across the land if you want, or you can ride a horse across the land, but really taking a river, taking a ship, I mean, that's the best way, most efficient way to get somewhere. And the Mississippi River, which still has this cachet, this currency in American culture, the Mississippi River played the role of, say, the Nile River in Egypt. Nile became famous as this kind of centerpiece for ancient Egyptian civilization with a fertile land around it. The Mississippi River similarly was this place which attracted a whole bunch of different settlements. And there you see some of the listings of them going back into the past. These inhabitants, some of them anyway, have been called mound builders due to the characteristic mounds they constructed. There you see an example of the kinds of mounds, combination of a kind of earth and industry, so to speak, rendition of Cahokia, a place with a population between 10,000 and 40,000, making it the most significant settlement north of Mexico. So as far as Canada and the United States, or what will become those places, that was as big as the settlements would get, something in the range of 40,000 people. Note the characteristic pyramid structure. I believe that this was the tallest pyramid north of Mexico at the time, maybe the third tallest in the Americas at that time, which would have carried multiple symbolic associations. Just as the ancient Egyptians built pyramids, the Native Americans built pyramids as well, not because they were sharing ideas, but because it seems as though there is something about the inherent symbolic value of building a giant pyramid shape. It's the kind of structure you can build at this time and also carries very symbolic associations, especially associations with the sun. Build a giant pyramid, you get that impression of being closer and closer to the sun, and the religious and spiritual beliefs and practices at this time would have endowed a lot of symbolic value to the sun as a progenitor of life, as the kind of the center of existence, and something that feeds the vitality of the world. So if you build a structure that makes you feel as though you're getting closer to the sun, there's that kind of spiritualistic dimension to it. But the other interesting thing about pyramids, we talk about the pyramid of society, and it's one of those kinds of very fitting, ironies of history in a way. The pyramid kind of mirrors the very stratified social order, where you have this base-like structure at the bottom, and that's where you find the great majority of people, the proletarians, the poor people of the world, the largest groups of people, and then you go up and up the pyramid, and you're finding wealthier people, more powerful people, more prominent people, and it just narrows and narrows and narrows, right? People at the upper echelons of society, the people who run things, constitute a very small group clustered at the top. And the people who lived here in Cahokia, near the banks of the Mississippi, would have adhered to the symbolic associations. You would have had a community leader who would have been a combined chief and priest. So someone who is all the leader, kind of politician, but also the person who handles religious practices, gives them their spiritual beliefs, and he would have literally resided at the top of the pyramid in what would likely be a wooden kind of structure, hut. So that would have been his home at the top end of society. Such settlements were not necessarily permanent. Many of them were abandoned over time. And this, too, takes us into a kind of interesting historical narrative. There's all sorts of reasons as to why settlements might become abandoned. Bad harvests, for instance, because they're growing particular foods nearby. Over-reliance on a single crop, which, it's funny how the more things change, the more things stay the same. We have our own over-reliance on particular foods and individual crops, especially cash crops, things that make money. Well, they had their own cash crops back in the day, such as corn, for instance, maize. There would be this idea that corn, well, it has a lot of nutritional value, thus just plant a whole ton of corn around and we'll just live off of that. Except if something happens, if the crop fails, then suddenly you're in dire straits. So that might have been a cause for leaving settlements. Infighting, because when you have permanent settlements, that's when you have the introduction of something that we would call warfare, although at this time more like pitched battles. But prior to sedentary permanent settlements, there were probably nothing in the way of wars or battles between groups of people. It's only when you have a fixed location, then you would have battles of this sort involving different groups of people or even fighting within the community. And also, crucially, a loss of faith in both a particular system such as irrigation or spiritual practices could lead to the dissolution of the settlement. The person who sits at the top of the pyramid, your resident chief and priest, he kind of has a responsibility that goes with that position. If everything's going to hell in the community, well, then the buck stops with that person, right? You need someone to blame for everything that is going wrong. And so if you lose faith in the individual who's running the system, well, that too could lead to displacement or even the dissolution of the community. Interestingly, too, the loss of faith in a particular system, such as irrigation, which was seemingly the story with Snaketown, reason why the people actually abandoned that settlement. They had ceased to believe that these irrigation channels that they had constructed were really paying off, were really useful anymore, and so they leave them. And that's that kind of subtext of history, because we would assume, and our assumption, I think, is very much a kind of a modern contemporary assumption, we would assume that as soon as a group of people invent something, a kind of a new system, a new tool, a new way of doing things, well, then they're going to maintain it because it's obviously better. It's new technology, new industry, it's more modern. Oh, thus they have to keep that going because history always proceeds in that sort of linear direction. Well, not so. I mean, the system, whatever it is, whatever new tool or implement or technology, it has to work, right? The people have to believe that it really is useful. If they stop believing in it, then they're not going to maintain it anymore. And so what happens to the people from these settlements when they're abandoned? Well, they probably become hunter-gatherer people again. So they leave this idea of permanent settlement and kind of disperse themselves back into a kind of earlier state. But from their perspective, they're making advancements over a system that is no longer working. So that, as I say, just a snapshot. We can talk further about the groups of people that are in what is now North America. And also, of course, we could talk further about the other cultures, nations, empires existed in Central America and South America. That gives you a sense of what it was like in North America. And I'll proceed into the second part, which discusses European imperialism. Say there the impact on the native populations of European imperialism and explanations for it, the search for new lands and access points to goods, and also Christopher Columbus. There's a painting depicting the fall of Tenochtitlan. That's the capital of the Aztec Empire that I mentioned previously, fell to Spanish conquistadors. And this kind of gets into the entire story of the European invasion and conquest of the Americas. Now, one of the points that's lost to history, perhaps not in a place like Iceland, though, however, is that there had been a short-lived European presence in the Americas prior to Columbus's voyages way back in the 11th century. So that's a long time before Columbus actually made his voyages. There was a brief Viking presence in what is now Newfoundland and Labrador. So they had been in the Americas. Europeans had been, but then that settlement, that community dies out, does not survive, and then you go for a bunch of centuries before you have a full-fledged arrival of Europeans in the late 15th century, which proved to be devastating to the native populations. The question is why? Why was the arrival of the Europeans in the America devastating to the local inhabitants? And I think that that is always a question worth asking, because I think too often we just revert to the assumption that of course it was devastating without actually looking in any depth or nuance at the answers. Well, typically when we ask that question, we get some more binary logic. And as I said, this is binary logic that basically builds on the dichotomy I mentioned previously. The idea, on the one hand, that the native inhabitants of the Americas simply did not have the technology, did not have the prowess, did not have the culture, did not have the civilization to resist the invasion. In other words, it reverts to that kind of explanation that the native people were too primitive or too backwards, and thus this more advanced civilization came in and rolled over them. It's one explanation, and then the kind of counterpart, the oppositional explanation, basically says, well, it wasn't the case that the native population was unable to resist this invasion. It was rather that the European invaders came from a much more exploitive, sadistic, and cruel culture, that they basically imposed their cruelty and sadism onto a culture that was largely egalitarian, existing in harmony with nature, had not been involved in the exploitation of the land, had not been involved in violence, and you probably heard both of those explanations peddled out, and they exist, as I say, within that binary logic. It's either one option or it's the other option, and they stand opposed to each other. Now, again, we should sort of approach the truth and the facts from both of those explanations and see what the kind of underlying narrative really is. You have the reductive self-justifying explanation, which I just mentioned, essentially the idea of what the Native American populations lacked, and that was the explanation for why the European conquest was, quote, successful. Well, let's look at some of the facts in terms of what would have made the native population vulnerable to an invasion. At this time, none of the population had steel weaponry, for instance, such as swords or daggers. They did not have armor, they did not have gunpowder, and they did not have cavalry. Cavalry would mean mounted soldiers, so soldiers riding horses. Now, yes, purely from the standpoint of militaristic technology, thus they would have been at a significant disadvantage because all the weaponry that the Europeans had would have been a step above what the native populations tended to use. Things like clubs, for instance, would have been popular among even imperial states like the Aztecs, which would not be able to stand up against steel weapons and things like armor. So the kind of technological militaristic advantage was there from the start. No cavalry because there were no horses at this time. Another thing, well, there was a general lack of a single unifying nation or empire, with the exception of the Aztec Empire. That would have been different as well. You had in the Americas at this time a lot of groups dispersed across the land, and as I said, a lot of different languages spoken at this time, a lot of different cultures, a lot of different settlements growing up, but for the most part, a kind of lack of a unifying central place. There wasn't really that kind of feel of a single capital, for instance. So this was open to a certain form of invasion that would exploit divisions or distinctions among different groups. But the biggest thing that the native population lacked would be, well, something that you wouldn't think was a bad thing. They lacked of various diseases at the time, which would be, I would say, the determinant factor in the European invasion of the Americas. Now, the people who lived in the Americas at the time, they certainly got sick. They certainly had different outbreaks of diseases and viruses, but they seem to have been less virulent and less fatal than the diseases that already existed in various other parts of the world, including Europe, including Asia, including Africa. There were various diseases that had had an impact on Europe that were devastating, and it seemed as though the people who lived in America didn't quite have the same diseases. The most famous example, the most infamous example is smallpox, which is a disease that is actually eradicated now, eradicated in the 20th century. But that was a disease that went through a series of characteristic outbreaks in Europe. Could be definitely a dangerous disease to people in Europe, but to the people in America, it was a deadly, fatal disease. I mean, huge numbers of people died from smallpox. Why? Because they'd never been exposed to it before. They had no natural immunity to the disease, and thus the introduction of a new virus and something that was extremely dangerous could just decimate the populations in very short periods of time. Why was this the case? Why did we have this difference? Well, we can only speculate about things, but there are a couple of explanations that have been given. You could say that there was perhaps more in the way of what we might call globalization, if that's the right way of putting it, in Europe, because there was a lot of different interconnectivity between different parts of the world. For instance, the bubonic plague, the Black Death, which tore through Europe in the 1300s, well, that was a disease that was introduced all the way from Asia, from China. It's made its way to the European continent, made its way through the travel and trade routes, through the Silk Road, up through the Middle East, and then into Europe, spreading all the way to the British Isles. And that's because you had that kind of interconnectivity, the trade routes that linked people together over long distances. As we've seen from the time of COVID, when you have the rapid transportation of people, the movement of people from place to place over short periods of time, viruses, diseases spread very quickly. And so in the Americas, you generally didn't have those extended trade routes linking all these people together. So you wouldn't have the same kind of spread of a really dangerous disease rapidly over a long distance. And the other explanation that's been offered has to do with domestic animals. It was probably the close proximity to various domesticated animals and species-to-species transmission that allowed all sorts of creative and new diseases to develop in places like Europe and Asia. The Native American populations, they didn't domesticate animals on the same level. They didn't live in such close proximity to a variety of animals. They certainly hunted them, but they weren't kind of living next to them all the time. And so that might have been another factor. And the growth of towns, the growth of cities, and especially reasonably filthy cities and towns, as would have been the case in medieval Europe, became hotbeds for the spread of disease and infection. And so when the Europeans arrived, they brought with them a variety of diseases that the natives had never encountered before and which were much stronger, more powerful than any that they had experienced previously. Oh, yes, so we need to take the break. So we'll come back at 10:54 then, look at the rest of the material.